It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Dr. Sharon Jacob. She will tell you it's because we both graduated from Lancaster Seminary, but that's not it. I graduated before she was born, I think. But she was one of our instructors for the TEL program that Pacific School of Religion we're doing with the Hawaii Conference. And one thing I will say, she's an assistant professor, Pacific School of Religion and New Testament. I will guarantee you that Sharon's going to prod us to think about things we may not have thought about, and to look closely and to read carefully. And she may even help us laugh a little at ourselves for our reluctance to see what may be there. But I don't want to take any more of our time. So please welcome Dr. Sharon Jacob.
Thank you so much, Jack. Thank you, Lori. And so wonderful to be with you all this afternoon, right? I think I'm currently in Orlando today. So I just realized it's a 7-hour difference, and I was constantly Googling to see if I make the workshop time right. But it's so wonderful to be here. I have been teaching at Pacific School of Religion for 3 years now. This is my 4th year. I am actually, I just got promoted to associate professor, yes, of New Testament. So I'm just super, super excited to be here. And this is something I love doing. I really love, coming in and helping us think through texts. Some of the ways I read biblical texts is I read it with a post-colonial gender, sexuality, and race lenses, and I often read it alongside contemporary context. So it's slightly different from just keeping biblical text in the historical context, but also trying to keep it there and also trying to pull it into contexts that are relevant to us today, our own life experiences, and read through that. So that's what I bring to you today, and I am very excited. We will be looking at the story of the Canaanite woman, and we're gonna tie in our scholarly lenses. We each are scholars. We bring our expertise into the text. But before we go, I do have the biblical text on a PowerPoint my PowerPoint presentation. But if you have something handy known as the Bible alongside, that would be helpful. If not, don't worry about it. The text is also printed out in the PowerPoint. So looking forward to it. And do I begin now, or are we going to play the video? Well, when you think about the history of PSR and the kind of work PSR has done around issues of race and gender and sexuality, and the kind of cutting edge work that we do, it's truly an honor. And every time I see that video, it always reminds me and makes me very emotional and so proud to be part of an institution like PSR. Well, having said that, let's continue with our work in that tradition of breaking boundaries and being unafraid. And part of biblical exegesis is to be unafraid. It is to be bold. It is to ask questions and give voice to those little voices in our head that we've always wanted to ask those questions, but have never felt a space created for that kind of conversation. So there are actually a couple of ways that I'm going to do my presentation this afternoon. The first is we're going to take, I need 2 volunteers, one to read the text on Matthew, and we'll have a really short discussion after that. Then we'll read the text on Mark, and then just have a really short discussion on that, and then we'll move into a kind of a semi-lecture conversation. I'm calling it a lecture conversation because this is more about just framing the text for us and then having a more in-depth conversation around the text and what it raises for us. So Reverend Ball will be the first person to read the text on Matthew, and then we'll have just a quick short conversation, and then let me see, Jane, is that right?
Yes.
Jane will take the Mark text. Meanwhile, if there are comments or questions that are coming up for you, please put them in the chat, and I will take them as we go along. But then towards the end, we'll try to have a more sustainable and a more fuller conversation. So with that, Reverend Ball, you're up.
The faith of a Canaanite woman. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came out to meet him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and to toss it to the dogs." "Yes, it is, Lord," she said. "Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed at that moment.
Lovely. Thank you so much. So my first question for everyone is, what do you notice in the story? Talk to me about characters you're noticing. How many characters are there? Who is speaking? Who is not speaking? Anything strange? Anything odd? We'll just take like about maybe 2 minutes and just talk with me through this text. Right. This is not the first time we've heard it, I'm sure.
She was a Greek, born in outside. She's non-Jewish, and that's number one.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but Jesus explained to her that the Jewish people were prepared as he came as a Messiah, and then the others are the ones who are going to be the recipient of his blessing.
Right.
But she never gave up on that, even though she never tried to argue with Jesus. she simply said, the Jews were referring to the Gentiles as dogs, that's how they were referring to Gentiles as dogs. So she didn't argue about it. She simply said, okay, even the dogs can eat the crumbs from the table. And
Yeah.
that was really touched the heart of Jesus to respond to her and heal, and to respond to her and answer her prayer.
Right. Yeah, very nice. I'm sorry, I have a thing with names, so tell me your name.
Sam Astamani.
Sam, thank you, Sam. Yes, so very, very well summarized. This is a Gentile. So as a Gentile, she is, that would have been something that the Jews would have called the Gentiles. And so, calling her a dog seems like appropriate lingo at that point. Others, yes, good. Others, what else? What else do we notice?
I put down that the forgotten people, the othered, out at the margins, challenge our idea of inclusivity.
Yes. Oh, I love that. Your name, sir?
This is Tino.
Say that again.
Tino.
Okay, perfect. Yes. What makes the story so unique is that, there is an idea of who belongs at the table, and the Canaanite woman is challenging that for Jesus. All right, good. A couple of other, maybe one or two more people in the chat. Oh, okay. Yes, I see over here. Are you? Oh, wait. Yes, the idea of inclusivity, says Tino. I imagine every woman that here has been called a dog while speaking truth to power. Exactly. This is not a comfortable text, is it? I mean, yes, the text says, the heading says the faith of a Canaanite woman, but remember, in the original text, which is written in Greek, that title is added on later. Is this story really about the faith of the Canaanite woman? Is this the story about, is it a story about, this woman being faithful, or is it a story about Jesus's faith being challenged, right? That is a question we could ask. Why do we always have to read the text from one perspective? All right, let me see another chat. There was something came up. Sorry, of Jesus repenting. Yes, right? Yeah. Could it be a story about Jesus repenting? Is this a story where he changes, not her, right? And she forces him to change. And how does she do that? All right. Jane, if you would mind reading Mark 7.
Mark 7, starting from verse 24. This is New Revised Standard Version. From there he set out and went away from the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast out the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone.
Thank you so much, Jana. That's beautiful. Now, if we take both these texts, right, you have the Matthew version, and I did something different. I made you read the Matthew text first because that's what we're going to focus on. And then you have the Mark text that you just read. What differences do you see between the two texts? We'll go into a little bit of a longer discussion on this. Are there differences?
The disciples don't seem to be keeping the woman away in this text.
Yes. Now pay attention. do the disciples definitely show up in Matthew, right? But do they show up in Mark? Are the disciples even a character in Mark? Seems like not, right? It seems like Jesus and this woman are having a conversation. So that's a significant difference, right? There are no disciples out there, right? What are the other differences you notice between the two? Are these both the same story? Are they telling the same story?
This is Jack, and in Mark talks about the demon possession. So it's a little different.
Yes, in Mark there is more information about the demon possession. There is also, as somebody said in the chat, that the ethnicity of this woman is different. While Matthew has named this woman as a Canaanite woman, Mark is calling her a Syrophoenician woman. It's slightly different. What about the tone between the two texts? Are the tone the same?
Jesus seems to be nicer in this text.
In Mark?
Yes.
Yes, Tina, that's right. Yeah, he's kind of nicer in this text, right? He's not what, when you look at Mark, excuse me for saying this, but he's kind of a jerk there. He's not a really nice man, right? But in Matthew, he seems a little nicer. Yes, sure, he still says, he uses the word dog, which is an epithet, and he does that, but it seems like the tone has escalated in Matthew versus Mark. There is also, in terms of the historicity of the New Testament, Mark was written first, right? Mark is a gospel that many scholars believe to have been written first, and Matthew and Luke would have used Mark to, as a source to write their own gospels. So it is quite possible that the author of Matthew would have read the story in Mark and has made intentional changes to the story. One being, of course, the tone of Jesus, the addition of characters, which is the disciples. The other would be the ethnicity of the woman, right? Clearly changing that ethnicity. I'm going to look at the chat a little bit more. In Mark, the daughter is not present. In Matthew, we don't know if the daughter is present or not. Oh, that's a beautiful close reading of the text. You're right. Yes. So there is, what we're focusing on is learning to read the text closely and critically. There are other differences. For example, in Mark, like I said, it's the Syrophoenician woman. In Matthew, it's the Canaanite woman. In Mark, there is no crying or addressing of Jesus, right? In Matthew, she cries and uses the term son of David. In Matthew, the tone, as I said, is escalated. This woman comes across as being more desperate than Mark's version. The woman does not merely ask Jesus, as in Matthew 7, verse 26. Mark uses the term herotao, which has been employed in situations of mere asking or inquiry. Matthew takes that and he turns it into begging or pleading to add a level of desperation. The dialogue in Matthew is more complex than Mark's, not only because the woman speaks for herself more often, but also, as I said, the disciples are involved. Notice in Mark, the disciples are not found. In Matthew, Jesus ignores her and engages with his disciples directly instead of her. So think about adding fuel to fire. This woman requests Jesus directly, and he, instead of speaking to her, decides to engage with the disciples about her request, right? So that's even more of an insult or humiliation. How much more does this woman need to take in order to get her point across? While Mark summarizes the Syrophoenician woman's request, Matthew narrates the Canaanite woman calling out to Jesus 3 times. And she uses the vocative Kyrie, which is Lord, right? In the first instance, she pairs her cry of Lord with Son of David. It is only after her first cry for mercy in 1522 that she explains her own situation. My daughter is demon possessed badly, kakos, right? So this is an escalation that you're seeing happening here. Let me just take a moment. Yes, I like that, you know. Yes, thank you, Reverend Ball. Yeah, just you have to read it from a multiple perspective. Mark can be, says Jane, Mark can be read as Jesus simply testing the woman for the right answer. Matthew shows the woman, Jesus's views being changed. Yeah, exactly, right? There are other differences. Pay attention to these differences. In Mark, verse 27, Mark says, first let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Now, what Matthew does is he adds a verse in there, right? He says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. As Sam rightly pointed out, the tensions between the Jews and the Gentiles in Matthew is escalated. This is no longer a story about just the other. This is a story about the ethnic other, right? The woman came and knelt before him. Lord, help me, she said. Then he says, it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. So if you notice, he adds 2 verses in there and then goes back and follows Mark. Matthew, in his text, intensifies Jesus's antipathy towards the Canaanite woman by omitting, let the children be fed first. He omits that completely, right? There's a sense that, you know, in Mark's version, there is a sense that, you know, once the children are fed, then come the other's turn. There's a sense of that, but Matthew completely takes that out. We see in chapter 8, you know, this is very interestingly, Jesus is more willing, right? And let me qualify that by saying Matthew's version of Jesus. He is more willing to go out of his way to heal the son or the servant of the centurion. But he is, but he is not as willing to help this woman out who is also a Gentile. So before we go into the conversation of who belongs and who doesn't belong, the centurion as a Roman, as part of the Roman Empire, seems to have no problem getting Jesus's attention, right? As a representative of the Gentile occupying force, the centurion's presence should be as offensive to Jesus as the Canaanite woman's. But interestingly, Matthew's Jesus behaves in a very strange fashion, right? I want to take a moment and let's just process that. What do y'all think about that? So before we jump into this idea of, you know, the children need to be fed first, Matthew's Jesus makes an exception for the centurion, right? But doesn't quite do the same for the Canaanite woman. Are people getting upset with Matthew's Jesus yet? No. Now remember, it's Matthew and the way Matthew tells the story. What do y'all think about that? What do you think about the fact that Matthew's Jesus will make an exception to the centurion and not the Canaanite woman? What does that betray? Let me see if there are chats. Straight up sexism, says Kyle. I love it. Yes. Interesting, says Phyllis. If we flip it, is Jesus calling some of his followers lost sheep while saying that the ones othered people are getting it? Could be. Yeah. Right? Yeah, it is straight up sexism. But there's something else apart from sexism that's happening here. What else could it be? Any clue? Any clue where I'm going there? Patriarchal system, yes. Roman occupation, exactly. The centurion, right? It's about power, right? Who stands in the power system? The centurion, as closer to the empire, right, is somehow given more clout than the Canaanite woman who is standing on the further end of the spectrum, right? So this is not just about sexism, while it is also about power, right? It's about the power and the way in which you will find ways to be closer to the empire. So when the woman calls him out, she calls Jesus out, she doesn't call out Jesus only for his bias, she also calls him out for her hypocrisy, if you think about it, right? She reminds him of what his calling is, or what his ministry should be, right? Let's talk about how this text has often been interpreted. Reception history is the study of how biblical texts have changed over time in different cultures and communities through transmission, translation, or reading or retelling and reworking. It explores all the different ways people have received. That's why it's called reception history. How do we receive this text? How do we appropriate these biblical texts throughout history? What are some of the ways this particular text has been read in the past? Historical critical interpretations have focused on the historical context of this text. They have highlighted the social situation of the first century Mediterranean as a territory that was occupied by empire, a perfect situation where conflict and competition for leadership is thriving. This perspective will often see the woman as representative of God's chosen people. And that's how they will tend to interpret this text. Very often, some of the interpretations that you yourself are drawing on are interpretations that are coming from that reception history that you probably heard in sermons or other avenues that you bring to this forum. There is another interpretation of the text called literary interpretation. This text, this kind of interpretation focuses on the characters of the story. This interpretation suggests that the woman is symbolizing Matthew's mission to the Gentiles and argues that God's kingdom is for all people regardless of their differences. I'm sure you've heard this interpretation too. Then there are recent interpretations that talk about the impact of the reader. In both the historical and the literary interpretations, there are other traditional forms of interpretation. The impact of the reader is not as front and center. Recent interpretations have started to bring the reader into the mix. How does this story, when I read the story, how does it impact me? What does it mean to me and my community when Jesus calls a Canaanite woman a dog, right? What does that mean? Under these interpretations, you have feminist biblical scholars. They will highlight the female character in the story and often will talk about the positive figure of this character who exhibits faith, overcomes prejudice, highlights the disciples' lack of understanding and shocks them into recognition. I think Reverend Tino, I think your the way you talked about how this is a story where this is a reversal kind of a story, like falls in that, right? It is a kind of a reversal. Then you have some scholars who are called postcolonial biblical scholars. They also make a similar argument in that they see this woman as a boundary crosser. She's a transgressor. They view her response as resisting unjust oppression, focusing on narrative's liberation. Scholars like Kwakbulan argue that we must see this woman as a colonized woman who is belonging to a colonized context, and they shy away from seeing this text as a kind of a conversion text. Because if you notice, in the end, once the daughter is healed, the woman goes away. She's not following Jesus. None of that is happening. So there is no such thing as a conversion, the way it was very often used. These kinds of stories were used in missionary context, in colonizing context, right? Such interpretations point to the importance of being included in God's kingdom without ever having to give up their identity, and resisting the way traditional interpretation continuously reinscribes Christocentrism into the text when the text could be saying something else. She, in the end, she is invited to be part of the kingdom, but never having to compromise who she is. So how would we then read the text today and see this text differently? So let's start with Tyre Sidon. As we've already seen, the author of Matthew changes the ethnicity from the Syrophoenician to the Canaanite. This change is quite strategic, right? In addition, the author also in Matthew makes a different change. While Mark just focuses on the location Tyre, Matthew adds Sidon in there, right? And the pairing of Tyre and Sidon is a cautioning tale to the readers that the territory that he's drawing on is hostile. The pairing, of course, has precedent in the Hebrew Bible, in the prophecies of Ezekiel, chapters 26 through 28, which talks about the destruction of Tyre, but also includes Sidon in the last verses, chapters 28, verses 20 to 23, right? The important difference is that while Mark's Jesus is the one who's crossing into the borderland. So in Mark, Jesus is the transgressor, right? He is crossing and lands in the border of Tyre. In Matthew, Jesus is remaining in his territory. He is not the one who's transgressing. In fact, it's the woman who's transgressing into his space. In Matthew 10, 5 through 6, it says, "Go nowhere among Gentiles." Therefore, this helps us see that in the story, the Canaanite woman is the outsider, she is the other, she is the one who's the transgressor, and she is the one who's the boundary crosser. Now, given that she's a Canaanite, this should not surprise us, because when you look back at the history of Canaanite people, they were often depicted as boundary crossers, transgressors, sexual transgressors, and the ones who were the other or the outsider. Let me just stop for a moment and just say questions or comments so far. I'm going to look at your chat quickly. Have challenged the norms to move this aside. Yes, yes, yes. Right, that's right. Male dominance. Questions or comments? Everybody's following me so much?
Can you
Yes.
explain again how Jesus isn't crossing boundaries at the beginning in verse 21?
Yes. So what happens is in Mark, he is clearly the one who is moving into a Gentile occupied territory. That verse doesn't really show up. He's the one who is remaining, and the Canaanite woman is the one who is crossing into his territory, right? When you look at the text, he's remaining where he is. She approaches him, right? But in Mark, he is leaving and he is going into a different land. Does that make sense?
You're saying by the absence of the reference?
Yes, yes, yeah. So okay, let me just show you right here.
Yeah.
So you see here, Jesus left that place and went into the vicinity of Tyre, right? He leaves, right? And then in Matthew, leaving that place, he withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, right? So that's the way that the wording is, right? The wording is that shows that he is moving out of that space in Mark, whereas over here he just withdraws and then he stays in that space and she finds him. Is that making sense? Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment too, because the context of the passage of the analysis from Matthew makes it to where Jesus is very cautious on his walk, and the persistence of the woman being aware of his cautiousness kind of in a way interrupts that for him and makes him very uncomfortable, to where Mark, he's very aware through the narrative analysis and the exegesis part of what the story talks and the passage explains is he's very aware that she understands that. Therefore, it becomes more aggressive in the way how he performs his attitude towards her, because he is recognizing that this is not the way that the mission is supposed to be. The news is getting out there. He's healing everybody, and he understands that there is now the word, and the word is getting out there, that his healing amongst the people is getting to people that he wants to convert, or he wants to make the message known before healing. And it's the same, and that's kind of where I was seeing it's the same context, but it's a different attitude from the different biblical standpoint. Thank you.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, and the reason for the change in the attitude has a lot to do with the ethnicity of the woman, right? Because if you think about Canaanite, let's go with Canaanites first before we go into Canaanite women. Where have we seen Canaanite people before? Where have we seen them? That's not a rhetorical question, folks. Some of you are smiling. That means you've heard this word before. Where have we encountered the Canaanite people?
Exodus.
Yes, Exodus, right? And it's a really I think they're frequently enemies of Israel. That is right. It's an Exodus, they're enemies of Israel. And yet what is really, really strange is that in the genealogy of Jesus, there are 4 foreign women who show up in the genealogy: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba. These are all foreign women. And they're also transgressors, boundary crossers in some way. They also come from a history that is sexually questionable in the way in which they get pregnant. So there is history there, right? 2 of the women, Tamar and Rahab, are Canaanite women, right? And as Eric said very correctly, these are enemies, right? These are enemies who are of Israel. The designation of the Canaanite by the author of Matthew is done purposefully and strategically to invoke certain stereotypes and certain histories that are associated with the people of Canaan. This is not a neutral thing that the author of Matthew does. He invokes this name because he knows there are certain stereotypes associated with them. He knows that when the people will hear this story, they will think of Exodus. They will think about what happened with Exodus. They will think about the ways in which the people of Israel were asked to go in to the land of Canaan and, literally kill all the evil people in there. Now, did it historically happen or not? That's a different question. But within the text, the idea was that the Canaanite people were evil people. The land was good, but the inhabitants were evil, right? So this designation is used to invoke certain stereotypes. Think about how stereotypes work in our own context, right? When we use certain stereotypes, it is to invoke a certain emotion, a feeling, a reaction. The woman in Matthew 15 is the only person in the New Testament who is explicitly called a Canaanite. While we find 2 more Canaanite women in the genealogy, Tamar and Rahab, as I said before, this woman is the only one who's explicitly named a Canaanite. She's not given a name, but she is defined by her ethnicity. Musa Dube, who's an African post-colonial scholar, says Jerusalem and Canaan are not only names of places, but also ideologically loaded geographical markers. When we hear the word Canaan, something happens to us. When we hear the word Jerusalem, something happens to us. These are not neutral terms. At the same time, this text also reinforces certain stereotypes of Canaanite women. Tamar and Rahab as sexual transgressors are now replaced by the woman in the story who also transgresses her boundaries. But what do we expect from these Canaanite women who refuse to stay within their limits, right? It's in their blood. right? And so then you see this kind of animosity or antipathy that Matthew's Jesus displays towards this woman. What is even more important is in all the stories of the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible, you never really hear the voice of the Canaanites, right? We never get their perspective. We know that the Israelites were told to go into their land, and because they were evil people or they were sinful people, that's what we are told about them. But did they see themselves that way? Did they see themselves as evil? Did they see themselves as unidimensional? Those are voices that are lost to us. And it's very important for us to find ways to either recover or give space to those voices. Let's look at some stereotypes of Canaanite women, right? In the Hebrew Bible, the land of Canaan, like I said, was seen as good, but the inhabitants of the land were seen as evil, outsiders, and the other. This woman and her daughter, called the Canaanite, are the worst of the worst, right? That's why Matthew changes their ethnicity. They are the worst of the worst outsiders, or the margins, like they're not just standing on the margins, they're standing on the margins of the margins, right? They are the ultimate outsider. They are also the quintessential enemies of Israel. Remember, in the Hebrew Bible, God had commanded the Israelites to exterminate the inhabitants of the land because their sins were so extreme, any kind of contact with them would lead Israel into idolatry and ultimately immorality. The Canaanite woman is not just a Gentile, but she is a representation of Israel's enemies. She is also a reminder of the history of occupation of Israel. Is it possible that when Jesus sees her, he is ridden with guilt that his people did to her people in history? Could that be a possibility? In postcolonial terminology, we have something known as haunting that we use. The idea of haunting is to bring awareness of colonial history to the present. In this way, is Jesus in Matthew's gospel knowing of his own history and knowing of the way in which he tends to be biased by these people, not because he is biased, but because he has been taught to see the Canaanites as the outsider, right? That's what's been taught to him. That's what's been coming down from the genealogy. Does that kind of history of his own history leads to his own haunting, reminding him that he may be colonized now, but he and his ancestors were once colonizers of these people? And could that moment be that moment of the guilt, the anger, and ultimately the change and the change that overcomes Jesus? Let's talk about the dogs, because we can't get through this text without talking about the dogs. The reluctant mercy that Jesus displays towards the Canaanite woman is troubling. I'm surprised nobody actually said that, Jesus in this story is very biased towards this woman, calling her a dog, calling her people a dog. He is insulting to her. He ignores her. Her persistence bothers the disciples. She comes to Jesus a second time begging for help. She kneels before him. Jesus not only refuses again, but intimates her and her people as dogs. The term dog causes a lot of exegetical squirming by biblical scholars, because we're always trying to find the positive in the story and we're trying to make sense of it, right? So there's a lot of like, oh, I don't know, maybe the dog could mean something philosophical. It's just an epithet. But the truth of the matter is, it is very despicable the way Jesus treats this woman. It's despicable. That's not what we expect of Jesus. Jesus' words are proverbial, nor the observation that the word used for dog here is diminutive. It lessens the force of Jesus reducing this woman and her people to animals, right? That's what he's saying. But then the woman is not finished. She comes back. She takes that insult that he gives and she turns it on his head. And what she does is in that saying where she says, surely, let me go back to that text, where she says, yes, it is, Lord. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. That verse becomes a way in which she takes the insult that Jesus gives to her and she turns it on his head and mocks him, gives it back by mocking him and reminding him of his own privilege and his power in this situation, right? The term mocking is something that postcolonial terminology uses a lot. They often talk about how people of color will take what the colonizers give them. People of color, colonized people, take what the colonizers give them, they mimic it, and then they mock it back and place it back in the laps of the colonizers. And in doing that, in pushing back, you push against the colonizer, and it's also holding up a mirror to show the colonizer that, hey, you are no better. You are no better than us, right? So she mocks back at him. Jesus, she throws the words back at him and, acknowledges that she is a conquered race. But she, in acknowledging that, she also kind of places Jesus, she pins him down with that comment and says, yeah, I'm a conquered race. And guess who conquered us? Guess who conquered us in the Hebrew Bible, right? We are dogs, but who brought us to that? Who brought us to that status? The begging for crumbs is also a reminder that her status as a conquered race and someone who's now reduced to crumbs is directly connected to Jesus's own heritage as part of an ancestry that once colonized and now is the colonizer, right? And that's the hypocrisy that she shows. The purposely posturing of herself as inferior could also be seen as a moment where the haunting becomes real. In that moment, Jesus is reminded that with his power and privilege, he is very close to turning into an empire like Rome. And that's that moment of change, right? That's that moment of change that you see. And though the text never tells us, but her response almost makes us see the ways in which Jesus flinches, right? You can almost see him say, ooh, I didn't expect you to say that. Oh God, lady, I didn't expect you to have a mouth on you. He flinches under her response, and rightly so. She's urging Jesus to do better, right? She's urging Jesus to be better. She's urging him to be better. She's also asking Jesus to reverse the stories of oppression and dismantle the stereotypes. She's asking Jesus to let go. She's asking Jesus to let go, right? And in that moment, the healing takes place. The Canaanite woman never converts. She never becomes a follower. But her response is what makes Jesus convert, right? He converts. He changes, because after this, his ministry becomes more inclusive. This is a pivoting moment for him. In this narrative, right, the Israelite is conquered by the Canaanite, right? Ideologically, right? That's the conquering, that's the reversing that is happening. So if we were to reinterpret the story the way we did, and we see Jesus as changing, letting go, discarding, expanding his own definition and vision of who is included in God's kingdom, how do we see ourselves changing? Who are we as a church, right? What are we letting go? What are we discarding? What are we changing? How are we innovating? How are we as a church becoming inclusive? Could we too allow ourselves to be open to being converted by standing with those in the margins and allowing ourselves to experience provocative perseverance, right? And that's all I have. I'm going to stop because I think there are 8 comments here. Tell me what y'all are thinking. Who let the dogs out? I love that. Yes. What were some of the things that were coming to your mind? Is Jesus, you see Jesus changing. He's letting go. But he also is open enough to allow himself to be open to change. Are we open enough to allow ourselves to change, to be open to change?
I'm wondering how many times people have come to the church asking for help, and how many times we have called them dogs or riff-raff or et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And I think there is a similarity here, right? Just as Jesus is reminded of his own complicity in empire, in colonialism, right? That way, that it's important, if the church needs to progress, the church too needs to be reminded of their own complicity in the way in which it has, served as a strong arm for empire and colonialism and missionizing tasks and the dehumanizing of people, right? That kind of coming to Jesus moment, let's say, right, is so important. Thinking of Amalekites, exactly, Eric. I think what we do is when we read the Exodus story, we think that, there is this promised land, and we completely forget that there were people already living in the land, right? I think one of the comments said, yeah, how indigenous people are fighting for our children and our people. Yeah, right. First and foremost, I have heard so many sermons on this passage, and it really ticks me off because we end up talking about the faith of this woman as opposed to the way in which this woman is fighting for her daughter, right? She's fighting for her child. And those of us, or not even those of us who are parents, but those of us who have loved ones will do what it takes. You call me a dog, I'm going to go with I'm a dog, but I'm going to do what it takes to get what I want, right? And this is not a story about conversion. This is a story about persistence. And the conversion does happen, but it has nothing to do with the conversion. It has nothing to do with the Canaanite woman. The conversion actually happens with Jesus. She gets what she wants and she leaves, right? She gets and she leaves. And that's usually how it is, right? Those of us who are people of color, we know exactly what we need to do to stay in the system, right? Or those of us who are standing on the margins, we have to stay in the system. We stay in the system. We get what we want. But the process is that the people in power, their minds need to be changed, and Jesus changes it. I think this is a great story for the church because it shows that Jesus is willing to give up his bias, his racism, actually, and be willing to see things in a different way. Right? I'm not, oh, hi, Linda, I see you. Hi, Linda. Linda was in my TEL class too. Yeah, so Moses asking God to spare the city, right? Yes. Yeah. Other comments, folks? Wow, I really shocked y'all into silence. I never do that.
This story often gets read as Matthew's way of justifying the Gentile mission or demonstrating the existence of the Gentile mission in Jesus' ministry. But this shift to the identity as Canaanite and all the complexity of empire, that starts to seem really weird to me. And so what is it that Matthew thought he was doing?
Oh, so Eric, that's you were the one who were making those great comments. you'll never know. I mean, I think we'll never know what Matthew was thinking. We'll never know. And I think part of the reception history is not to be bothered by what Matthew is doing, but to be bothered in the way in which we are reading and we are perpetuating it. I can give you some educated guesses as to what Matthew was doing. Remember, Matthew is also a more Jewish gospel, right? He has that entire story on Jesus. First of all, he starts with the genealogy, right? He connects Jesus to Abraham. So that's very important for Matthew. Secondly, he is also asking Jesus to, he has the whole Herod narrative, right? And his Jesus, Matthew's Jesus, looks very similar to Moses, right? He's built that Jesus character around Moses. So the changing of the narrative into using the Canaanite woman plays back into this Old Testament or Hebrew Bible context, right? He's trying to evoke certain stereotypes. And we can talk about it as missionizing, but like as many post-colonial scholars have talked about, this story is not about missionizing, because Jesus actually fails to convert her, right? She says, hey, I want my daughter healed. He says no. Then she points out to him how incredibly ridiculous he is, and he heals her, and she's like, see ya, right? And then she walks away. So this is not a story about conversion, but I have often been so surprised that people read this as a story about conversion, and we miss the point. Because while it is a story about conversion, it's not the story, or missionizing, it's not the conversion story of the Canaanite woman. It's a story of Jesus being converted, and she converts him, right? So that's the way I would answer. Does that help? I don't know if that helps, or yeah, okay.
It would be interesting to think about the Great Commission at the end of Matthew. And seeing this as an example of what that looks like, about,
yes,
instead of going in and saying we're going to change them, but going out into the world that we might be transformed by the faith of another.
Yes. Oh, Ben, preach that, write that down. Hallelujah. Yes, because it is in the conversion. It's not in changing the other, but it's in the interaction, or what post-colonial context calls when the colonizer and the colonized meet. That contact zone is what post-colonial calls. In that contact zone, they change, and they're changed forever, right? So there is no way to say that only she changed and not him, because he changed too, and that interaction is changing, right? It's not about power. It's not about a power trip. I think, if anything, this story is a great way to talk about missionizing in a different way. Thank you, Ben. Sorry, Jane.
This isn't the only time in the Gospels when Jesus has a retreat interrupted, and I feel for him. But the more you talked about, the woman doing everything she could to save her daughter, just highlights what a separation there is.
Yeah.
Jesus can take a spiritual retreat.
Yes.
Could she ever in her lifetime think of having the freedom to get away from the life situation she's got? Yeah. Not at all. And the Jesus and the disciples' irritation at being interrupted there, I think, is something that plays into this, the difference in the status between these two parties, and how they can't talk to one another.
Exactly.
Because their lives are so different.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that, because again, it is the woman who has to remind Jesus of his privilege, and she does, right? He has the privilege to take the retreat. He has the privilege to say no. He has the privilege to even say, yeah, not feeling, not in the mood today. She doesn't. She's a mother, right? And she's going to put herself on the line. for her daughter. And I also want to tie this to the conversations around Black Lives Matter, right?
Yes.
This story particularly
Yes.
has been read a lot with Black women. And in the Black Lives Matter movement, how Black women who have experienced police brutality have, for the most part, been overlooked, right? They often talk about the Black men who have experienced police brutality, and as Black women often say, you know, our daughters, our bodies are often overlooked in these conversations of race, and that's very important to pay attention to. Like this, you know, to think about this Canaanite woman as a Black woman who's fighting for her daughter, right? And she's not going to take no. And what are the stakes? The stakes are really, really high. So keep that in mind too, right? Yeah, I know we need to wrap up. I know Laurie said just maybe another 1 or 2 comments, and then thank you so much for just being such wonderful players.
Couldn't we put this story when the slaves began to read scripture, and when the Native Americans began to read scripture, and when the Hawaiians began to read scripture, and how they became the people who converted the church?
Yes, and that's how it should be read. You know, that's why I told you I get really ticked off when I hear, even when I read the faith of the Canaanite woman or the faith of the, it's not about that. I think it's the perseverance, the provocativeness, the challenge, right? The challenge that these 2 characters, particularly the Canaanite and the Syrophoenician woman, bring to the church, the way in which many of us, those of us who are people of color, have brought to the church. And sometimes we have to push really hard in order for the church to even, you know, be inclusive. So why not? Yes, yes. Thank you, Reverend Tino. Exactly. I hope you'll all preach this sermon, those of you who are pastors or those of you who are in church, please teach this text from this perspective. It will save lives, you know, and it saves perspectives. Yeah. Right. And notice she never followed Jesus, right? She stayed true to who she was.
We want to thank Sharon for her awesome workshop this afternoon, and we will find a way to get her back again. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for your questions, your comments, and sharing. Thank you everybody.
Thank you. Mahalo.